Catholic missionary work among the colored people of the United States, 1776-1886. The source is Records of the American Catholic Historical Society of Philadelphia, June 1924, volume 35. Says here, from the article by T.F. Meehan referred to above, we learned that there were 970 Negroes living among 4,848 whites. Dodged the hijack. What whites? Does that mean complexion? In New York in 1712. The year before there had been a slave market on Wall Street, right? How did Wall Street really start? And not only were Negroes sold there, but also Catholic Indians were sold into slavery by reason of their color, which is swarthy. Can I get a so swarthy? Catholic Indians who were very swarthy. That's why they were being enslaved, because they were swarthy. The New Yorker said even did an advertisement for one of these Catholic Indians, says, ran away 18th August 1733, a Negro Catholic who speaks very good English. You see how they left the Indian out? Do you guys see how they left the Indian out and they just put a Negro Catholic? But they were just making distinctions between Negroes and Indians, right? So now all of a sudden he's a Negro too. So what does Negro really mean? When we're talking about statuses, it says the Negroes, especially those who came from Catholic countries, were not totally uneducated, as can be seen above. All right? Who's these Negroes coming from Catholic countries? A lot of those were not just Indians or Catholic Indians. A lot of those were Latinos, Sephardic Jews, Moors who had been expelled, who had been sent to plantations, who had been sold into slavery. And yeah, they were educated. Many were educated. It says the myth and the beginnings of French colonialism in the Americas, of the savage, the myth of the savages. While the policy of creating one race was doomed to failure in New France, as elsewhere, Amerindians and French were still distinct entities at the end of French regiment in 1760. Still, there was enough intermixing for a writer in South Carolina newspaper in 1742 to refer to the French as swarthy brethren of Amerindians. The French were what? Swarthy. They were black. The French were black brethren of Amerindians. Listen to this. Now we know they just described the Indians as swarthy, right? So swarthy Indians and swarthy French people, right? So if they come together, what do you think is going to happen? Listen to what happens. Shortly afterward, in 1753, Abbe Maillard noted that intermixing had already proceeded, so for that, in his opinion, in 50 years, it would be impossible to distinguish Amerindian from French in Acadia. It's impossible. Why? How could it be impossible? Well, we understand and overstand now why. Because they're both swarthy. They're both swarthy. They may look the same. They might have similar features. They might be anciently related. How can you misplace an Indian from an Acadian, right? If Acadians are white, right, and they dress a specific way, and Indians are a specific way and look a specific way, as how they told us that, how can you not distinguish that? You get what they're saying, you hear, right? Swarthiness all over the place. You can't distinguish who's who. And how often did this happen in history, in American history? And we only remembering the Indian part, because we always assume the European was white, So that had nothing to do with us. That was just the name we took on. Or that was just the slave master who raped my great, 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 great. No, no, man. I love you. You know, two major genealogies. That's what I'm trying to show you here. By the Marshes of Minas, by Charles G.D. Roberts, author of The Forest in the Forest. All right. It says here, Gaspar of the Black Lemerchants. Of the village floors, a thick beech wood stretching over toward the mouth of the river habitants, and there by the river part of Grand Prix, yet set apart from her, was the little settlement of the Black Lemerchants. Who's these Black Lemerchants? With its barley and flax fields, hand from the beechwood, its snug acres of dike marsh snatched from the habitants' tide. The Lemerchant men were dark. Listen to this. The Lemerchant men were dark. Even for Acadians, they were dark. That means Acadians were dark-skinned. They were known to be dark-skinned and very dark-skinned. But this particular group of men or family, the Lemerchants, were very, very dark complexion. Even for Acadians, all right? Even for Acadians. Unlike their fellows, they were of Basque rather than Normandy or Picardy blood, swarthy of skin, black-haired, black-bearded, and with heavy, coal-black eyebrows meeting over the nose. All right, remember I told you. So we got Acadians who are Norman ancestry and Acadians who come from Basque ancestry, both swarthy people. They're described many times as very dark, the Basque. They well deserve their name, the Black Lemerchants. Blackest of all. A Lemerchant of the Lemerchants was Gaspar, son of Pierre. The blackest of all of them, Gaspar. He was the blackest of all of them. It was blundering speech. The swarthy and lean-faced woodsman was an unpracticed lover. Far less knew he of women than of lynx and moose and panther, and in presence of Celeste his wanted subtly failed him. They're talking about one of these Lemerchants who were fur traders. A lot of these were the Coursier de Bois. Yeah, the merchants. That's what it means. Les Merchants. Yeah, they took on the merchant name. It says here, The Acadie and the Acadians by Luther Roth, author of Our Schoolmaster, pastor of the Church of the Redeemer, Albany, New York, from 1891. And it's talking about the Micmacs here, the Aborigines, as it says on the top. It says, an amusing instance was that in which a gentleman was bargaining with an Indian for some feathers, when his wife remonstrated with him for giving too high a price. Indignantly, the swarthy Micmac regarded her and then broke out. When Indian make bargains, squaw never speaking. All right, the swarthy Micmac was mad. He said, when I'm speaking, you don't speak, man. The swarthy Micmac, swarthy. Everybody's up there, swarthy. What you talking about, white people? What white people? On another page in the same book, it says, the manner of the deportation of the Acadians may be remarked upon. It was cruel and unnatural. It can be justified only under the plea of military necessity. All right? It says, before the council were summoned the commissioners from the French inhabitants of Minas and Pisiquid. They were little swarthy men with fierce mustaches and keen black eyes, likewise deeply sensible of their own responsibility as spokesmen for their people. Swarthy Acadians, swarthy, so-called black, while through it roamed the swarthy Indian, once again its undisputed lord. The swarthy Indian. Says here, Secret Plays of Thunder by Portland Morris. Richard Duval laughed heartily and was joined by the boatman Octave. Shiloh narrowed his eyes on as he considered the swarthy Acadian. Swarthy Acadian absolutely refuses to speak English. He thought irritably, but I did hear him that first night. The swarthy Acadian, so swarthy Acadian, black Acadian, the dark-skinned Acadian. All right, so we continue, right? And we're in the Library of Congress right now. This is an old newspaper. The New Orleans Daily Democrat from 1877 says, our people, where they came from originally, the source of the population of Louisiana, all right, Louisiana. Who were our forefathers? Not the far distant apes and jellyfish to whom Darwin traces us, big one, but those more immediate ancestors that converted Louisiana from savagery and wildness to its present state, to whom we owe its peculiar customs and habits, and not least of all ourselves. Much of our history of the past can be explained, much of our future prophesied, if we but know these ancestors. All right, so that's deep. This article is really deep. You can know your past, you can know your future, you can prophesize what may, because if you know who you are, if you know your ancestors, just as one can map out the character and disposition, the traits and habits, all right, traits and habits, the culture, right, the whole future of a child, if we know his parents and their dispositions. The early origin of people is generally obscured, and with reason, since it is almost always obscure, base, often dishonorable. Dishonorable. This is a newspaper telling you straight up. They lie about history. The nobility of England are proud to trace their descent from a gang of robber chieftains. The ancestors of the hill people of Georgia were rescued from the London debtors' prisons. All right, remember the convicts and indented servants? All right, this is real history. While Australia owes its first society and earliest patriots to ex-convicts and tickets of leave men, just like in the American colony. So likewise, there are several stories of the first people of Louisiana, particularly of its first ladies, that the early colonists would gladly have covered up and hidden if they could have done so. The French. The original masculine portion of the population was well enough. It was for the most part honest but adventurous Canadian voyagers and coureur de bois. All right, who's these Canadian people settling in a lot of them were Acadians, people from Quebec, Huguenots, and coureur de bois, right, the fur traders, the slave traders, who many times married indigenous women. Coureur de bois, I got a whole video on that. How they were enslaving American Indians and selling them to plantations to the colonies everywhere. Sturdy, bold, energetic men who fought and worked their way overland and down the river through the endless desert wilderness peopled with dangerous savages. They came along and without family, since none but men could endure the fatigues and hardships of this arduous journey. Here they languished away in single blessedness and melancholy, bachelorhood as long as they could stand. It save a few led astray by the dusky charm of some forest maiden. At last, good King Louis took mercy on their loneliness and shipped an experiment, several cargoes of females. And just here comes in the bar sinister. For these females were Magdalenes. Listen to this, prisoners from the royal prison of La Salpêtre. Such were the first women of Louisiana. Who's the Magdalenes? About Moorish Sephardic women, Moorish women, right? They're sending them to the Coureur de Bois because they were lonely. The Magdalenes. Such were the first women of Louisiana, the first women of European descent, I mean, whose morals, the less said, the better. For as Governor Cadillac declared to the parish priest when he proposed the purification of the colony by shipping these home, if I send away all the loose females, there will be no women left here at all, and this will not suit the views of the king or the inclinations of the people. However, for want of better wives, the colonists welcomed these with open arms. But although these satisfied them, they did not, by any means, satisfy the directors of the Louisiana Company. Yes, the Louisiana Company. And they proved a failure in one of the most important needs of the new country, children. These women couldn't give them children. To supply the deficiency of a cargo of girls known in Louisiana history as the filles de la cassette, or casket girls, were sent over by way of experiment girls. Poor, ugly, but virtuous. The experiment proved a signal success. The girls commanded fancy prices and supplied the needed want. So now what did they start doing? Because they had the, they were the ones in control, because now they had the pleasure to give the men, they started what? They started becoming pimps themselves. They started doing fancy prices. What do we know about Louisiana and the Chatels and the Bordeaux, huh? Understand? This has an origin. All this stuff has an origin. In the infancy of the colony, Louisiana felt proud indeed if he could only trace his origin back to these caskets instead of the two of the correction girls. It was some half a century after this that the first Acadian found his way to Louisiana. All right, Acadians. He came to us persecuted, wanderer, without country or home. He was so hospitably received, fed, clothed, and lodged that, well pleased with the country and the people, he pitched his tents upon the soil of Louisiana and peopled his western prairies. All right, pitched his tents, teepees. He pitched his tents. The Acadians were sturdy, stalwart, built race, shown in their disposition and every feature their northern or Norman descent. They were bony, Siouxy, with high cheekbones, and their complexion swarthy and bronze, all their features bearing so close a resemblance to those of our aborigines. Listen to this, all right? They were swarthy complexion, bronze people. The Acadians, French Acadians, right? And they had a so close resemblance to those of our aborigines as to give rise to a somewhat wild theory that the climate of America had an Indianizing effect on Europeans. What? And that a few centuries of it would convert us in complexion and disposition into Sioux and Modocs. The true explanation of the undoubted Indian physiognomy is perhaps more easily and naturally explained in the frequency in the earlier days, listen to this, of Choctaw wives, a custom so prevalent in the colony at one time as to beget a schism between church and state. On this point, the parish priest coolly suggested that if a man could get no better wife than an Indian squaw, he had better remain single altogether. If you can't get a good woman like a Choctaw Indian woman or squaw or an Indian woman, you better stay single. All right? Deep stuff here we're learning. Let's go back. Again, Acadians are what? Swarthy complexion, bronzed. All right? Just in case you don't know what swarthy means, it's dark complexion. All right? And they saying that they resemble Indians. We know a lot of the Acadians were mixing with the indigenous people for years up in Nova Scotia, to the point that they were saying in 50 years we wouldn't be able to tell them apart, remember? And remember the Indians up there were swarthy. Now they're saying that they're also swarthy and they look like Indians too, because not only did they do that in Nova Scotia, but when they were up there in Louisiana and other parts, they were marrying indigenous women. All right? Now, this is what I've been trying to explain to everybody. So you only got, let's say, you got only that history of the Choctaw grandma, right? Who did she marry? Was it always an Indian man? Was it always a white slave master? No, a lot of the times it was actual black French people who loved each other. They loved each other. It was both Negro, so-called Negro, black, so-called black people coming together, right? With time, you only remember one side because you assumed the other side was white. And I'm trying to talk real stuff right here to hope nobody's getting hurt and nobody's like feeling like I'm trying to like take their Indian away. I'm just trying to show you another possible ancestry genealogy. And a lot of you, not all of you, a lot of you. No, now they're saying it has to be the weather. Oh, mate, the weather makes Europeans black in America. America has an Indianizing effect. What does that mean? Indianizing meaning they're being colored. They're becoming more colored. They're getting swarthier in America. And again, they were mixing with Choctaw wives. The Cajun was a prolific as his Canadian cousin. In 1765-66, some of 866 Acadians arrived here. In 1788, a few more came, making altogether perhaps 1,000, who today, after the lapse of less than a century, number at least 40,000, covering the whole western portion of the state and extending even to the Red and Mississippi. Before the Acadians came, Louisiana seemed to have partaken of the character of the Parisian ancestors. Paris is a terrible consumer of lives. The provinces poured yearly into it thousands of sturdy, hard-working, ambitious men and women only to be consumed by this monster. In the first few years of Louisiana, the decrease of the population was quite alarming. The census of 1721 showed that of the 7,020 colonists who had come over to this country and settled here, only 5,420 were left. Louisiana was a sieve into which emigration was ever pouring without filling up the country. In 1731, the white population, the hijack, was still stationary. So it's not growing, listen. White people not growing, right? And in 1745, 40 years after the first establishment of the colony, the white population amounted to only half of the number of persons who had established themselves here. And were all these even white? Like pale complexion? White was a status. So they're even admitting that even the white was really low, it never grew. Again, these are all Swarthy people in Louisiana. It says here the Spanish. The Spanish settlers of Louisiana were for the most part brought over by the government, fed, supported, and cared for at the government's expense, and established in various posts throughout the state. As the Romans of old established their colonies in a conquered country. Listen to this. This is how the Romans conquered and colonized. They didn't do it with their own people. Pay attention. This is what they're going to say. Romans of old established their colonies in a conquered country to assure its fidelity. The colonists were from the Canary Islands, just then suffering under blight, and whose inhabitants were starving to death, and were called by the Creoles Islanders, a Creole corruption of Isleños, or islanders. The chief Spanish colonies were at Tours, Aux Bois, St. Bernard, Galveston, Baton Rouge, Valenzuela, La Forge, and New Iberia, right? Iberia, where the Moors were. Around all these localities, some of their descendants still linger, but at the Terux books alone do they preserve their individuality, their race, language, and customs in the midst of a different race. I just want to say that this, again, newspapers from the 1800s, along with the Spaniards. Now listen to this. This is major drop coming here. Along with the Spaniards also came quite a number of Gypsies who established themselves in the western portion of the state, not far from Natchitoches, a race so dark and swarthy. Gypsies, a race so dark and swarthy that in the eyes of the Negroes, they were always regarded as some strange free Negro race. Gypsies, Negroes, very dark. These lingered near Natchitoches as late as 1840, but have since disappeared. Where did they all go? Just like the Mayas disappeared, right? Just like these tribes disappeared, you didn't disappear. Amalgamation, assimilation, mixing in. You are Cajuns, so-called Louisianans, African Americans. It's not just Indians, but they did. A lot of these people, most likely these Gypsies, mixed in with indigenous women as well, who were also dark-skinned, dark complexion. Again, Gypsies were, Negro. We already got this drop in my videos. And who the Romani, shout out to Drop Nation, who the Romani, who the real Egyptians, right? Gypsies, right? Gypsies, Egyptians. They were very dark and swarthy, strange free Negro race, right? Although their former settlement can still be traced in the liquid black eyes, the dark complexion, the somewhat idle habits of their descendants. The only other Spaniards in Louisiana, a few persons of Mexican descent on the uncertain Texas border, the office holders, a respectable class of good Castilian descent, who, living at New Orleans, intermarried with the Creole families until they lost the all-Iberian peculiarities, save their names and some needy Catalans. The Dagos of these days, who have since melted away into other races, they have melted, they have disappeared too. What did they become? Let me guess. Maybe, possibly, eventually, African Americans too, or mixing with Indians, becoming so-called colored mulattoes, Creoles. You know what I'm saying? The other Spanish residents, never very numerous, left for Havana when the long banner of Castile and Aragon no longer floated over New Orleans. Again, Library of Congress, the New Orleans Daily Democrat from 1877 from March. And we just continue. We're just going to breeze through the rest of this. Thank you for tuning in. The Acadian Proscript, a historical drama in 5 acts. Walter S. Kerr. Moise Dernier, small, alert, weary, swarthy, weaselish in actions, speaking poor French and worse English, concurrently with excessive gesticulation and exclamations, Acadian messenger, an interpreter between the official French and English officers. He who has a hairy appearance, with attire that is bizarre, gay, and dirty. Moise Dernier, swarthy, a black Acadian. In the University of Cambridge, it says here, before race mattered, what archives tell us about early encounters in French colonies? Since the start of the 18th century witnessed a change in attitude on the part of colonizers, French administrators in North America began to argue against interracial marriages, which would mix good French blood with bad Native American blood. 1723, the Colonial Council of Louisiana issued an edict forbidding all Frenchmen and any other subject of the king who were white, dodged the hijack, to marry savage women. The number of mixed marriages dropped, and in 1738, one governor observed that the Illinois Indians do not invite the French to marry their daughters any longer, and the French do not think about this anymore. Children of mixed European and indigenous heritage, Metis, the Metis were actually mostly formed by the relationship of the Huguenots and the local indigenous population, whether they were Micmacs or Abenakis or Botoc people, and they became known as Metis, the offspring, which became known as a tribe. They were, by the middle of the 18th century, frequently considered to be inferior. French colonialists complained that Metis children were extremely swarthy and naturally lazy. Now I'm going to ask you a real deep logical question. If these French were white, as they call them here, right, why would their offspring be so extremely swarthy? You get what I'm saying? So when you mix an Acadian Huguenot with a swarthy Indian, you get extremely swarthy Metis children. Extremely swarthy. All right? Dark complexions were seen as indicators of racial inferiority and the alleged licentiousness and brutishness that had long attributed the natives were increasingly believed to be fixed. Official documents listed colonial populations under headings such as Negre, Negro, Mulatto, Metis, mixed, and savage indigenous. All right, they were calling what? Metis, indigenous people, Negroes. How can they be Negroes if they're mixing with French and Indians? Where did the Negro come in? How can you call the son, the offspring of a French and an Indian, a Negro, if neither of them are supposed to be Negro, right? But the reality is they were both so-called Negro, and that's why their offspring were extremely swarthy. The Free Library. This is from the book The Call of the Wild, Chapter 1, Into the Primitive. We're talking about a person named Perrault. It says here, that was the last he saw of the man in red sweater. As Curly and he looked at receding Seattle from the deck of Narwhal, it was the last he saw of the warm Southland. Curly and he were taken below by Perrault and turned over to a black-faced giant called Francois. Perrault, a black-faced giant, Francois, with a French name, right? Perrault was a French-Canadian and swarthy. Perrault was what? French-Canadian and what? Swarthy. Black, right? Black. But Francois was a French-Canadian half-breed and twice as swarthy. Get what they're telling you? So the French were swarthy by themselves. But when they mixed with indigenous people, their offsprings were what? It said here, extremely swarthy or twice as swarthy. Twice as swarthy. They were a new kind of man to buck, of which was destined to see many more. All right, many more of these offsprings are being created. And while he developed no affection for them, he nonetheless grew honestly to respect them. He speedily learned that Perrault and Francois were fair men, calm and impartial in administering justice, and too wise in the way of dogs to be fooled by dogs. Right? What is Swarthy? Pelican Publishing Company regarding an article talking about the Acadians of New Orleans. I didn't get the whole thing. I just wanted you guys to see this. They want people to make sure they know what Swarthy meant. And as it says here, Swarthy, dark-skinned. Dark-skinned, Swarthy, right? Dark-skinned. It says here, original narratives of early American history. Voyages of Samuel de Champlain, the actual guy who founded Quebec and the Huguenot who helped found Acadian Quebec. He actually wrote a book, right, of what he experienced during his voyages with the Indians and everything. And it says here on page 51 of his book, all these people of Nuremberg are very swarthy, dressed in beaver skins and other furs like the Canadian and Iroquois savages. They have the same mode of life. All these people of Nuremberg were very swarthy, very dark, adding an expression, very dark, very swarthy, very black. Where is Nuremberg? Nuremberga. Nuremberga is a legendary settlement in northeastern North America. They say legendary because when the Vikings and all that history of all that, they went to Nuremberga. Yeah, they were here. Vikings, the Danes, the Black Danes. Nuremberga was a real place. It's not legendary. That's why they had maps from 1570 showing Nova Scotia as Nuremberga. And that's why this guy just said Nuremberga. He's not thinking nothing of it during his time. In the 1600s, he's calling Nova Scotia Nuremberga. Yeah, the legendary place the Vikings and Eric the Red and all these people went to, which was featured on many early maps from the 1500s until European colonization of the region. It was alleged that the houses had pillars of gold and the inhabitants carried cords of pearls on their head. Now listen to that. At what point did it change? And it says here, continuing in the same book that he wrote, the Huguenot. The Huguenot is the one writing this. And he's saying all these people are well proportioned in body without deformity and are agile. The women also are well formed, plump, and of a swarthy color, in consequence of certain pigments with which they rub. So they keep saying that they rub oils and that's why. No, they're swarthy like that. That's their natural color. And who do we have here? Matthew da Costa. Matthew da Costa was a member of the exploring party of the Pierre Dugois. Remember the Huguenot? So Matthew, the famous Matthew da Costa, who I talked about in my Columbus and his Negro friends video about the black conquistadors. He was one of these guys. He was one of these black conquistadors known in history as a black man. They allowed people to know because they couldn't hide his pictures. They couldn't hide his descriptions. So they turned him into half African or half free black, right? I was going to read about him a little bit. He was actually with Pierre Dugas. He was with Demons and Samuel Champlain. They were all Huguenots, right? What does that tell you about him and about the Da Costa family? He was the first recorded free black person to arrive on the territory of today's Canada. Matthew da Costa, openly black. Yep. French. Yep. Trader, translator. Nothing to do with African. There is no proof he's African. In fact, if you do his history and research, you'll see where he's coming from. And it says here, Canadian Savage Folk, Chapter 4, Races and Languages. The literature of Eastern and Central Canada. When it's talking about the savages, as they call them here, or the Indians, right? It says, their laurels were won in revealing the heroism of savages, the gracefulness of and beauty of swarthy maidens. Swarthy maidens, remember how beautiful they were, attractive. They was like, man, I gotta get me an indigenous woman. I gotta get me an indigenous woman. Beautiful. Great bodies. Picture that. They stirring these and appears supposed to many to be a barren waste. All right, so again, swarthy, dark skin, swarthy Indians, swarthy French people. You guys get the pattern, right? Sneaking.